Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Looking at a book which has come to us from the Legal Action Group. That's the Access to Justice charity. This book is an interesting book. It's only a short book. It's 200 pages. It's called Clustered Injustice, with the subtitle And the Level Green. And it's been written by Luke Clements. We'll come on to what's in it in a minute. I've described this book in the title, A New Approach for Those Suffering Injustice, because that's effectively what we've got. We're in a period of very great difficulty across the world at the moment with COVID-19. The pandemic is still raging, although we do have a vaccine, but it's going to take some time to sort that out. This book, I think, is quite important. It's come to me at the end of 2020 when things are beginning to change. We've probably got the light at the end of the tunnel. This is the book here anyway. Let's have a look at it. It's called Clustered Injustice, as you can see. Now, the visual, for those who don't know what this is, the visual is, these are bowls, and it's a sport called bowls. That's a bowling green, and that's the little ball. And you have to get the bowl as near as possible but not touching. It's just to explain for those who don't know what bowls is. That's the book anyway, and there's the spine. Then there's some blurb on the back, which I'm going to refer to in a minute. Let's have a look at the book first of all. It's a very light paperback. There's a nice index, not too big, at the back, by page numbering, which is quite helpful, and it's looking at a whole range of issues concerned with what we're facing as practitioners basically at the moment in terms of justice and injustice. Then we've got a little at the back, we've got a series of notes which are to cover, I'll just get to the right bit, these notes are to cover each of the chapters, and they're effectively the footnotes, so that they will give you all of the information to expand on some of the areas that are being discussed, because we're talking about justice being a level playing field for everybody. That's really what he's trying to get at, but he's talking about clustered injustices, if you like, which is a problem. Now, Luke Clements is the Cerebra Professor of Law and Social Justice at the School of Law for Leeds University, and he's a solicitor. There's the front page there. Let me just explain that the Legal Action Group, for those of you who don't know, it is actually a national independent charity which campaigns for equal access to justice for all members of society, and their aims are to provide support to the practice of lawyers and advisors, which they do brilliantly in my view, inspires developments in that practice, yes, campaigns for improvement in the law and the administration of justice, absolutely, and stimulates debate on how services should be delivered, and this is actually part of their work. Now, there's a very nice dedication there, which I shall just show you. We only review books that we like. I do not consider it's a good idea to review a book I don't like, because it's not fair on the author. They spend a lot of time on the book, and I don't see why they should be criticised by people like me anyway. So I'll only go for a book that I like. There's the preface, and what of course Luke says is the central focus of this book concerns the extent to which our legal system generates and exacerbates disadvantage, even when there is no conscious resolve to do. It seeks to describe what a better system would look like from the perspective of those who live with disadvantage, but ultimately a system that is better for all of us. Now, obviously, we're not talking about ivory towers here. We're talking about some practical measures that might be looked at. And again, Luke explains how he started the book during COVID and was looking at ways of dealing with it. He wrote the preface at the beginning of September. At an incredibly bleak time, we must therefore hope, he says. Well, that's exactly what we're all doing at the moment. And there are the acknowledgements there. But again, it's an interesting book. It's not a difficult book to read, this one. It's worth reading because it's quite easy to read at one go. There's a contents section there, because actually the book's less than 100 pages long when you take all of the notes out. You can see the various contents section. There are in fact seven chapters. The last one is Doing Justice, Harm, Parceling out of the Soul, Public Sector Bureaucracies, big problem that, of course, which many people come up against, Juridification and Identity Laws, What are your problems? Personal legal problems are singular. The grain of the law, and of course various other things. There are of course a number of appendices at the back. Then you've got, as is the case with LAG, you've got a little index to the chapter at the beginning. Then you get into the book, and there's a nice quote for each chapter. Normally there's a little quote, and then you get into the actual book itself, the introduction, the meaning of clustered in injustice. This book is concerned with the legal problems encountered by people who live with disadvantage. Then it lists various people, and there are a lot of them. Now, obviously, at the moment, the legal system is in chaos. The courts are certainly in a fairly substantial amount of chaos. There have been very strong attempts to sort things out, but there are a lot of difficulties, and they're not going to go away in 2021. So we have to see where we go. But that's the beginning of the book there, and then you start on disadvantage and legal problems, clusters of legal problems, vulnerability, disadvantage, and undue privilege. Again, you've got to be very careful here, because these sometimes could be perceived to be allegations, but I have not been happy about the way, for instance, some cases are listed, because obviously there are concerns about why some people's cases are heard and others aren't. And you begin to wonder why Mr. Depp, for instance, can take over 4 or 5 courts to hear a libel action, when in fact there are a very large number of other people who are waiting to have their cases heard. Now, it's not for me to start making a great deal of comment about that, but clearly that's a very big problem for a lot of people, and I'm going to leave it at that. And of course you then get on to areas such as, this is an interesting one, chapter 6 on harm. It's an area I deal with. Warrior mothers and fathers, unacceptable behaviour and difficult people. Well, in fact, again, that's something I come across in my family practice. Now, what do we say about this book? Because it is thought-provoking, clearly, and that's why I said it's a new approach, because it's time that we did think about it. It's a new book from Luke. It's concerned, as I say, with legal problems encountered by people whose lives are disadvantaged, and the list is quite substantial here. It's covered on. He repeats himself occasionally, and I think it's worth repetition, because we're talking about disabled people, carers, homeless people, people on low incomes, people falling foul of immigration law. It's a long list, he says. People in this position often experience multiple and synchronous, I'll get it right, a bit of a long word that one, synchronous legal problems. In other words, clustered problems. They all basically come together. So in fact, if you've got one problem, you're going to be part of a number of problems all together. And in an era of pandemic, some of these problems are going to get far worse. Now, the question then is, does the court system, do the judges, does the government actually understand? Remember, we've got a separation of powers between the courts and Parliament, but do they understand? That's really the question, because the argument is, does the traditional single issue lawyered approach still work, and is it ill-equipped to deal with these problems? Well, I think we all know what the answers to those points are, and I think we're on the cusp of some very big changes that are eventually going to have to take place because of what's happened with the pandemic. Because such people that we're talking about, to cite Stephen Wexler, who's referred to, quote, do not lead settled lives into which the law seldom intrudes. They're constantly involved with the law in its most intrusive forms. In other words, they're the vulnerable. And their legal challenges don't come in single discrete packages, such as a particular claim, like a personal injury claim, buying a house or getting a divorce. They're problems which are multiple, they're interlinked and successional. And of course, anybody like me who's a practitioner will know that you get the client coming to see you with one problem, then you realise it's not just one problem, there's a whole range of difficulties associated with the one problem which builds up. And that's really where the clustering comes in. So no sooner has one problem been addressed than another is encountered. And of course, what Luke is doing here is looking at the causes and effects of clustered injustice. He describes the harm that results and why core responsibility for this harm rests squarely with the state. Now, that's another issue in its own way, because if we're looking for blame, there's a lot of blame to be attached to a lot of people. We could do what President Trump does and blame the Chinese. We could do all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, is that really that constructive? Now, it's not. I'm not looking at a jurisprudential model here at all. But what I am suggesting is we want to question where we're going, because I think the basic aim for most people is to try and get something positive out of what is a lot of what would have been described by Donald Sutherland possibly as negative waves. In other words, problems, very negativity all the way through. Now, the problem then is the analysis which is given here draws on systems thinking, a bit of a trendy phrase, that one. Vulnerability theories. Well, people are vulnerable. But the question then is we look at things like gaming analogies to illustrate the invidious position of people who experience clustered injustice, people compelled to play legal and administrative games in which the odds are heavily stacked against them. Now, it's not of their choosing quite often. That's another thing. I defend, in quite a lot of cases, people who are forced to go to court because that's what has happened to them. It's not people who've initiated the proceedings. They're actually people who are defending. And it's a very different approach, because my general approach is we never go to law. That's the approach unless you absolutely have to. It's not this Tony Blair approach of at the drop of a hat, oh, you've got your rights, go and enforce them. It's not like that. And that's the difficulty that we've had for some time, in that people have thought, oh, we'll go to court, when in fact that's not the remedy. That's one of the reasons I'm a mediator as well as a barrister at law, because I do believe mediation as an alternative dispute area is a very useful way to do it. It doesn't always happen at all. Now, the structure of the book, let me talk about that so that you know what's in it. You've got the introduction, which is the meaning of clustered injustice, the grain of the law, it's called, the loaded nature of the law and its bias towards those who enjoy advantage, of which there are quite a few. Now, again, there are people who will take different views, but there is that imbalance, and there's no point in denying it because it is there. So the question is, what is your problem? The legal system's inability to deal with entangled clusters of problems. Look, that goes back hundreds of years to the building and the creation of the common law itself, then the refusal to expand the common law, the types of claim which led to equity. You can see the problems historically, because you've then got difficulties like the fragmenting of these clusters of problems into disconnected elements. It's called juridification. Now, clearly what lots of people would like is, you've got a load of problems, let's go and deal with all of them at court. Now, of course, it doesn't work like that, because you've got to get the balance between what one party is saying and what the other party is saying. But you can see the idea would be to try to dispense justice. It's a bit of a rough and ready way of doing it, but that might be able to bring things, to consolidate things, which is what I certainly have to do in family proceedings, where you've got the family provisions of the divorce, you've got the financial remedies, the children issues, houses, all sorts of other problems, land. You've got all of these things, and if we can consolidate them with orders like non-molestation orders and so on, all of that can be brought in, and you can then start looking at the overall picture and getting some orders. Now, that would be nice in a whole range of other areas of law, but it doesn't necessarily work like that. Obviously, you've got a whole question, again, one of the areas that Luke does look at is this concept of public sector bureaucracies, which we see in the very serious problems developing with council tax arrears. That is going to get far worse in 2021. You've then got damage by command and control systems, harm, the physical and mental harm caused by those who experience clustered justice and so on. Then doing justice, how a responsive state would and should address the phenomenon of clustered injustice. It's an important area to consider. I don't think there's any willingness on behalf of either the government or the state to do too much at the moment, but at least you can start getting a foot in the door and putting the points forward. Then at the back you've got an appendix, which is a brief overview of the various groups who have experienced clustered injustice. Now, I've got a date for the publication of this paperback, as the 25th of November 2020, and I'm recording this at the end of the year. Let's just have a look at it again. You've got the notes, which actually start on page 145. You can see the notes there. Quite a substantial number of notes, because the actual body copy of the text is a gross. It's 144 pages. It's not actually, but it's easy to read. There are no irritating little footnotes at the bottom because you've got them all there. Then right at the back you've got, as I say, you have a range of useful points trying to give some detail. The appendix is actually called, I'm just getting to that after chapter 7, the appendix is called Disadvantage. And again, it lists the people. I mean, we're looking at the people who've got the problem. That's asylum seekers, disabled adults, children, gypsies, homeless people, domestic abuse, precarious tenancies, poverty, debt, unpaid carers. And these are the areas. And that's why I think it's useful to at least have this debate coming out now. And I'd like to thank the Legal Action Group very much for producing this work, because I think it's an important contribution to what is a serious issue at the moment. Thank you to Luke and to Esther Pilger and everybody at LAG for producing this very thought-provoking work. I'm sure this is not the end of the subject by any means. Bye-bye for now.